This podcast is brought to you by Free Buddhist Audio, the Dharma for your life. Our work is funded entirely by donations from our generous listeners. If you would like to help us keep this free, make a contribution at freebuddhistaudio.com/donate. Thank you, and happy listening.
He said, I think on more than one occasion, that you don't or didn't consider yourself to be the ideal person to start a Buddhist movement. Can you remember saying that? And
I've said it and I've written it.
Yes. What did you mean by that?
Well, I meant quite a lot of things. First of all, I wasn't very well educated in the ordinary sense. I never went to university. My knowledge of languages, especially European languages, is limited. I could have made a much more exhaustive study of Buddhist philosophy. And there are many people who've done much better than me in those departments. But I seem to have had the right combination of qualities, limited though they were, for that time, that period, when it came to starting a new Buddhist movement.
Sure. Just to go back in time to, let's say 1964, 65, 66, when you first were about to begin work with the Friends of the Western Buddhist Order. A question that's often occurred to me is how difficult it was for you to adapt back to the West.
People have recently been asking me about that, and I've been thinking about it quite a bit. And I don't think I had felt any difficulty about adapting back to the West, because I adapted back to the West only to a very limited degree. I didn't go and get married. I didn't take a secular job. I carried on involving myself entirely with the Dharma. Just as I was giving lectures in India and teaching meditation and writing, I did exactly the same thing at the Hampstead Vihara, and I did exactly the same thing when I started the FWBO. I did not get involved in ordinary Western, so to speak, worldly life. I saw it, of course, and I came to know more about it. I listened to the radio, and of course I walked around London, and I heard what people had to say, but I didn't throw myself into Western life as such. My life was still very much a Buddhist life, even though I was back in Britain.
I remember you telling me once that you used to go and sit in pubs and just watch people, observe.
Yes, that's true.
Yeah.
Most of the people who were coming along in the early days of the movement, like those who'd been coming along when I was teaching at the Hampstead Vihara, were, for want of a better term, quite middle class. And I knew that there were other classes, of course. So I think one of the things I wanted to do was just to observe something of those other classes, just sort of give me a more balanced view.
Sure.
I think you could, so to speak, look at that as, I don't want to exaggerate this, sort of re-establishing contact with my roots in the social sense, because I came myself very much from a working class family.
I suppose another aspect of returning to the West was that you were leaving behind a world of traditional Buddhism in which you were, a monk. So again, I wonder whether that was an adaptation that you needed to make.
I'll go back a bit, because in India, I didn't function simply within the Buddhist community. So I had a very wide range of contacts. That they weren't Buddhist or religious entirely by any means. I think that's evident from my memoirs. In a way, when I came back to England, my range of contacts, socially and culturally speaking, was much more restricted. I can only remember one thing in connection with adaptation, as it were, from the Buddhist point of view, and that is, I didn't feel very comfortable going about in robes. I did so, of course, for quite a few years, but they evoked such very different responses from people from what I could have expected in India, that it wasn't, so to speak, very comfortable to go around wearing them. So there was that factor, which of course I'd never had to experience in India. Though I must also say that there was a time in India when Buddhist monks were very unpopular. That is to say, during the mass conversions.
I mean, something obviously too that you would have done a lot of at that time as you started to engage with the West and presumably the Western psyche a little was you probably read quite a lot to immerse yourself in current Western thinking.
Yes and no. It depends what one means by current Western thinking. I think in my days at the Hampstead Vihara, I think I was reading more Christian literature. Thinking, of course, that, well, I'm back in what is, to some extent, still a Christian culture, so perhaps I'd better brush up on my Christianity. So I did quite a bit of reading in that field. And later, in the early days of the FWBO, I did read the books that so many other people were reading, like Be Here Now, and like Erich Fromm's Fear of Freedom and The Art of Loving. And of course I read Jung, and I read, what was his name? He's forgotten now, I'm afraid. Leary, was it?
Timothy Leary?
Timothy Leary, yes.
Yeah. I got the impression, I think most people got the impression, you were quite well versed in the writings of the humanistic psychology, Reich, yes, and Janov, and
of course, yes, I read Reich, yes, because my friend Terry was very interested in Reich, and I did read Reich fairly extensively.
Yeah, yeah. Do you think that helped you to get your bearings?
I don't think I was concerned with personally getting my bearings in the Western world. I was speaking now to Western audiences, so I wanted to get on their wavelength and communicate to them in a way that they could understand, or communicate the Dharma in a way that they could understand. So if I threw in a reference to Fromm or to Jung, well, they would feel that, well, we're on common ground.
Mm-hmm. Your decision to start a new Buddhist movement came in the slipstream of your, in a way, virtual ostracization by the established British Buddhist world, the Buddhist Society, the English Sangha Trust. I just wonder how you felt in those days, whether it was something that you could just look on quite dispassionately as, well, people do get upset and these things happen in the midst of conditioned existence, or whether it was actually quite a painful time.
I don't think it was very painful for me as far as I remember. I think it was more disappointment, because I was thinking, well, among, say, Buddhists in the East who were born into it, one might expect those sort of things. But here are people who have entered into Buddhism voluntarily. They've, so to speak, been converted. And I think I therefore had expected a much higher standard of them. And I therefore was disappointed when they didn't, so far as I could see, live up to that standard and even behave in a way which was quite un-Buddhistic. But I also saw very clearly that this is an opportunity. And I think that outweighed other considerations. Because I think I've mentioned in the latest volume of memoirs that even when I was at the Hampstead Vihara, where I was exploring the possibility of doing things in a different way. But it didn't seem possible at that time. And had I tried to start up something on my own, I would have been accused of creating a schism in the already quite small Buddhist movement in Britain, and mainly in London. But here I was, I'd been invited to start up a new Buddhist movement.
Well, but did the conditions surrounding that decision give any particular extra fire to your decision to start a new movement? Do you think it made you more determined than you might otherwise have been, or even more bloody-minded than you might otherwise have been, or ambitious?
Well, emotion certainly was involved. I certainly didn't start up the movement just to spite certain people. But I must admit, I felt certainly rather satisfaction of being able to function successfully without their support.
Yeah. Yeah.
I could say I didn't need it.
I mean, you were starting the FWBO at quite a special time. I mean, it was a special time and maybe a special opportunity. It was London in the mid-60s. Were you aware of, to what extent British culture was in flux and almost a new kind of person was beginning to emerge, potentially a new kind of follower?
Well, I'm not so sure that I was aware of that. Of course, I knew that things had changed in Britain in many respects since I last saw it, which was during the war. And of course, yes, I was aware that there were, what shall I say, alternative people around. Though, of course, the first members of the movement and of the order can't be put within that category. No. They were all, or nearly all, quite middle-aged, respectable people holding down conventional jobs. And of course, when it emerged that I had in mind something a bit more revolutionary than they were prepared for, they dropped away.
In those days, you grew your hair long, you wore rings, you didn't wear your robes all the time. And I suppose I'm wondering whether this was simply representative of something happening in you, or whether there was an element of PR, of making signs to this generation.
No, I don't think there was anything of that sort. I just did it because I felt like doing it. I have to admit that. If there was any sort of signal, it's connected with the fact of my coming to the conclusion, or coming more firmly to the conclusion, that, as I later put it, going for refuge was primary and lifestyle was secondary. It's also connected with the fact that I'd established an order for both men and women, an order which was neither lay nor monastic. So I didn't want to identify myself with the monastic side nor with the lay side. So in order, I suppose, not to identify myself with the monastic side, I let my hair grow, which monks don't do. And in order to identify myself with the monastic side, I continued sometimes wearing my robes. So if it was a statement at all, and I think this was fairly conscious on my part, it's that I'm neither a monk nor a layman.
The FWBO, among other things, gave you increasingly over time a platform from which you could speak out. You could, through your published writings, which we could publish, through the talks that we could organise, and so on. You were able to articulate your critique of some aspects of traditional Buddhism, or for that matter of Western culture. My impression is that that's always been quite important to you, to have a platform.
Yes, I think it is important to have a platform, so to speak. I found even at the Hampstead Vihara, it really does help to have a constant audience, that the same people coming and listening to you week after week, month after month, you are able to develop your ideas. So I think from that point of view, it was important to me to have a platform, because platform means an audience. And certainly in the course of my lectures and writing within the FWBO, I have felt that I was addressing an audience. I didn't aim for a wider audience. If the wider audience overheard me, well, so much the better. But basically, I'm concerned with these people, some of whom did become my disciples. I was concerned with them and with their personal development. And I therefore addressed topics as I thought would be of assistance and inspiration to them.
It links up with something I've wondered over the years. Was it important to you from the outset that you saw yourself establishing a movement that would have many centres, that would be worldwide? Or was that not on your mind?
That wasn't on my mind. I was just dealing with the situation by which I was immediately confronted. I think, had it so happened that we didn't expand and there was just one centre in London, I think that after a while, there would have been other people able to carry on, and I think I would have gone back to India and carried on with my work there and visited back in Britain from time to time. I think that's what I would have done. I think I probably, at least initially, didn't have the same creative response to the situation or the possibilities in Britain than I had in India, where the mass conversion movement was concerned. I was greatly stimulated by that. I could see there was a tremendous need for the Dharma among tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, even millions of people, and that did evoke a very strong creative response from me. There was no situation like that in Britain, and therefore perhaps there wasn't such an intense creative response from me at that time, and not until the movement got going to a certain extent.
As we started to develop our various branches and our institutions, I'd say you communicated at times a passionate intensity around it, and I'm wondering whether at that time you felt a kind of fervour around the possibilities that you saw opening up.
I think I did, yes.
How optimistic did you feel?
I certainly thought that we could make a serious contribution to the development of that sort of world. I certainly didn't have any unrealistic expectations, but I certainly did hope and expect that we would be able to make a substantial contribution to the development of the new society, especially, of course, through our team-based right livelihood businesses.
You clearly hoped, when we started to establish our world within a world, our new society, that somebody living an FWBO life would get all they needed for a balanced, healthy, growthful life.
Well, that depends on the people who are entering upon that life. And sometimes one doesn't know what problems they bring with them. And some people have brought with them quite a few problems. And those emerge sooner or later. One cannot tell in advance, even if one is a Buddha, I think, what problems are likely to emerge. But certainly, I think living in a single-sex community, working in a team-based right livelihood business, being an order member or a mitra, does give one optimum conditions. But one has to be in a position to take advantage of those optimum conditions, and not everybody is. And some people have thought that they were in a position, and maybe their friends may have thought, but perhaps they were not. And of course, there's also the question of some people not being prepared to rise to a challenge which they could have risen to.
You must have been aware, I suppose, of how young we were, how young some of us were in terms of our experience of Dharma practice. A lot of us, I imagine, were quite largely sustained by just youthful vigour, youthful idealism, and youthful peer dynamics. And yet, you took us very seriously and expected a lot out of us. I mean, I can remember myself being a centre chairman and the movement's publisher, and I was, 25 or something. I'd been ordained a couple of years.
But then I'd started up very young myself, and I was still not very old at that time. I think I had great faith in the capabilities of young people who were relatively free to do what they thought was really the best thing for them to do.
I wonder how aware you were of the complications, so to speak, that there were in our relationship with you. You were older than us, you were bigger, wiser, and it was your movement, so to speak. And so inevitably there were projections. People would do things to win your approval and so on. I'm aware from other conversations we've had in the past that you were aware of that sort of thing. I wonder, in a sense, how aware of it you were, and whether you would spend much time thinking of strategies for dealing with that.
I was certainly aware of those sort of complications, but to what extent I was aware then, it's very difficult for me to say, because it also varied from one person to another, depending on with whom I was dealing. I knew that there were certain people that I had to distance myself from a little, because they were becoming rather too attached.
But for you, the experience of being surrounded for the most part by people a lot younger than you, much less experienced, whether that was something that made you feel a little isolated in relation to us, or whether you simply felt you were right in there with us, what your experience of it was. How separate from us did you feel?
I certainly don't think I felt separate from the people around me, because to begin with, it was a very small group. It was an intimate group.
Sure.
And I saw them, most of them, quite regularly. So it was that I had this small group or circle of people around me, and I certainly don't think that I felt at a distance from them, as it were. And I was, yes, very much into what they were doing, and I was there with them when they were doing it, so to speak, in spirit at least. So I certainly didn't think of myself as sort of in isolation from them, and they were out there doing the things I wanted them to do. I never felt that at all.
There was an interesting, I'm not quite sure what the word is, I was going to say tension, between your public statements, by which I would include statements in seminars or even at the dinner table, and sometimes how you would come across one-on-one in a kind of Kalyana Mitra relationship. For example, you were quite openly and consistently critical of the extent to which people would lose themselves in neurotic sexual relationships. And there was quite a long era in our history where anyone involved in a heterosexual sexual relationship would feel in an uncomfortable position in relation to the group. The group's attitude, seemingly at least, to have come from things you said. And yet if one went to see you personally, as I can remember doing myself, to discuss one's sexual relationships, you were so kind, so understanding, so tolerant.
Yeah. Well, of course, when I see anybody, one-to-one, whether it was at that time or now, I give them my whole attention, and I'm just concerned with them and their particular problem, if it is a problem, and just that. I'm not concerned with, so to speak, applying any sort of general rule to their situation. I don't think I ever do that. I see what they are like, what they're going through, what their situation is, and respond to that. But when I speak, as it were, more publicly, I deal in generalities. And then, of course, I follow the Buddhist tradition. And, of course, the Buddhist tradition is that if you are free from domestic encumbrances, you are more likely, at least, to be able to give all your energy and attention to the Dharma. So that was my general stance.
But also, as for example, represented in your short story, The Artist's Dream, you had a pretty intense relationship of your own with that degree of totality.
Well, I remember the artist's dream very well, and that grew directly out of my experience on retreats. And it mirrored that experience.
To the extent that you saw people being distracted?
Definitely. So blatant. And my experience on those retreats gave birth to the artist's dream.
But just for a moment to take the artist's dream as a paradigm of, if you like, a public statement, or what seems to be a public statement. My sense is that you have always been, when it's come down to the individual, completely open, completely empathic, compassionate, and so on. And yet, clearly in statements, the sort of statement implied by the artist's dream and so on, there are these much more challenging, demanding points being made, which the FWBO's culture would take hold of and give a life perhaps quite separate or different from the life that you intended in the first place. And again, I'm just interested to know whether that was something you were aware of, that was happening, that there was a dynamic in our culture that could translate you into something perhaps a little harder edged than you intended.
Well, I'm sure that happens sometimes, because I'm being translated all the time. Sometimes people translate later into softer terms, sometimes into harsher terms. That happens all the time. I think everybody practically in the FWBO, especially in the order, does translate me to some extent. And it falls on one aspect of me rather than on another.
And as maybe those waves of cultural excitement over certain issues and views, as they ran through the movement, possibly there were times when you thought, well, for the sake of the experiment we're conducting, let's see what happens. I mean, I suppose, let's take the example of what happened in Croydon during the 80s, where you must have known that some of your ideas and teachings were being applied in a pretty rigid and even harsh way. I mean, I know you were aware of that. But I also wonder whether, there was also on your part an openness to the fact that, well, we don't really yet know how to do it, and at least there's energy here. Let's give it a go and see what happens for a while. No,
I wasn't at all happy with the way that things were going on in Croydon at that time. I didn't think of that as an experiment or as an interesting way of applying what they thought were my teachings. I didn't see it in that way at all. I thought what was going on there, as I'd come to know about it, I definitely thought was wrong. But it was very difficult to get the people there to admit that. And also, of course, Croydon was set up as an independent centre, like all our centres, so they weren't obliged to listen to my advice. They couldn't be forced to listen to anybody's advice. One can't set up a relatively democratic organisation and then complain that somebody doesn't intervene in a dictatorial way. So we had to find some way of handling the situation, which we eventually did. I certainly didn't think of Croydon and its degree of extremism as an interesting experiment or something that could be allowed to take its course. I saw it as a development tendency that had to be stopped. I saw that quite clearly. And in the end, it was stopped.
But to also have to, in a way, watch and wait and bide your time and work kind of cautiously and slowly because of those factors.
Well, I'm used to waiting and watching and biding my time, and I still do it.
But that presumably was painful. I mean, I can remember the occasion, an occasion, and in a way quite a crucial occasion at Padmaloka, where you finally revealed the extent of the pain you were in.
Well, it certainly was painful because it was a distortion of something that I had taught or something that I wanted to do. Well, there were these lines in Kipling. If you can bear to see the truth you've uttered twisted by knaves to make a trap for fools, that is a very painful thing. Kipling puts it more strongly than I would care to, but that's the nature of that situation. It was very painful. And of course it is also painful to me, even now, to see not when people are implementing my teachings more rigidly, but when they are implementing them in a much more slack manner. In some ways that is even more dangerous and even more painful. And that has been going on.
Does it frustrate you that perhaps not enough of us have lived that life as wholeheartedly as not only you hoped, but as would suffice to create the kind of critical mass out of which a powerful situation would arise?
Well, there has been that critical mass, I think, in the past. My only concern is that perhaps we no longer have it. I say perhaps, because I'm fully aware that there are good people in the movement, order members and mitras, who are very faithful to our objectives and who really do get on with their practice, whatever it is, and are genuinely trying to lead committed Buddhist lives. So my hope is in them. But whether they constitute a critical mass at present, well, the movement's pretty big, and I'm not able to say.
The other day when we were talking, you referred to what you termed, I think, as a belated adolescence that you felt or feel that some people are going through in relation to you, and I wonder whether you realise just how challenging people have found you. What a powerful presence in each of our psyches you have been, particularly for people who've worked close to you. To a degree that, irrespective of any intention on your part, could feel oppressive simply by virtue of your size and your degree of primacy.
Well, I've noticed it. I don't want to get too particular or too personal, but I have noticed it. That even not so very many years ago, people could feel, order members, even senior order members, feel quite oppressed by my presence, which did surprise me, and feel much more free to talk and chat when I was not around. And I was a bit disappointed by that. That after so many years, they still feel that way about me, as though I'm a bit like the headmaster. And they may be prefects, but prefects are also students in the school, and headmaster is headmaster. So I have been rather disappointed that some senior order members haven't grown out of that.
But do you think there is a part you play in that?
Well, I'm the object of those feelings, so to that extent I do play a part. But one of the things I have learned is that human nature is unfathomable. You cannot predict anybody's reactions. So whatever steps you may take, wherever careful you may be, there's always the X factor in them which may produce unexpected results.
Sure. In the early days of the movement, it was quite widely known and talked about that Bhante doesn't meditate. What you said at the time was that you didn't feel the need to, because insight was arising in you quite naturally and spontaneously all the time. I suppose the question behind this is how you would describe your own spiritual life over these last years. Has your work been your spiritual life, or have there been all kinds of threads developing quite in a way privately?
Yeah. Well, the work has been my spiritual life, but not entirely. And it's also not quite correct that I never meditated, but I have meditated from time to time intensively for a period, maybe for several years. But also, of course, I do spend a lot of time reflecting. And that reflection can go very deep. And yes, there is insight there. I don't want to make any claims. I've never encouraged the making of claims by anybody. I think that can be sometimes misleading or unhelpful. But yes, intuitions have been there and intuitions have developed, and I've reflected on them Sometimes there are experiences that come to me quite spontaneously, not as a result of any effort, whether in meditation or otherwise. But this is rather more difficult to speak about than it is to say, well, every morning at 6 o'clock or 5 o'clock, as I did in Kalimpong, I used to meditate for such length of time. It's different from that. Also, of course, there's my whole dream life, which I don't usually talk about. Dreams have been very important to me, and some of them, of course, are or have been and still are of a visionary nature. And this has gone on all the time. And of course I reflect on those experiences. I had such an experience just a couple of nights ago. And there's a very important series of dreams prior to my handing on my responsibilities, for the movement. All during the preceding week, every night I dreamt about my teachers, and I dreamt about all of them. Now previously I'd often dreamt about my teachers very vividly, but usually just one at a time, from time to time. But on this occasion, that week, every night I dreamt this one or that one or 2 or 3 of them, and in the course of the week I had dreamt about all of them several times. So that sort of thing is also going on. I have these, what I call sort of archetypal dreams. They're not always archetypal, but very often they are. And even when I was very ill the year before last, as it is now, I had many such dreams, which seems to balance, the very difficult and painful experiences of the day, due to chronic insomnia. I was often wandering in an unknown city, and I was quite often, again, usually in India, with a group of Tibetan monks, or with a group of yellow-robed Theravada monks. Some of them my old friends. Sometimes I was chanting with them. Sometimes I was just listening or watching them perform pujas. I had that sort of dream a number of times. And a few of my teachers came into those dreams, not very many. I remember perhaps especially Dilgo Khyentse came into them. But there were other very beautiful dreams where I was climbing up a steep rocky mountain, got to the top, and then coming down the other side, I came to beautiful green fields or a beach and the sea, and was seeing very beautiful Turneresque sort of scenes. Those dreams were very common.
Your personality is pretty even. It's highly mediated by your degree of mindfulness. And so it's possible sometimes to think, well, the Bhante I met in 1970 is not very different to the Bhante I know now. But actually, I rather suspect you have changed a lot. But would you say you have changed a lot in these years?
Well, how much is a lot? Well, it's very difficult to say. Yes, how long is a piece of string? But I'm sure I have changed. But it hasn't been a dramatic change. I think the story of my life, and maybe especially my spiritual life, has been one of steady, I hope, growth, but certainly not dramatic ups and downs.
But you've been content throughout this period that you at least have felt engaged with a growthful...
I have felt that I've been doing something worthwhile, which is, I hope, beneficial for others and certainly beneficial to me. This may sound strange to say this, but I've been very much inspired by my own lectures, because, not always, but I think, certainly when I gave most of them, I was in a very inspired mood, very inspired indeed. And they were sometimes quite difficult to come down to earth afterwards, as some people might have noticed.
I mean, something that one could say is that by coming to the West, you attenuated at least your links with any teachers or Kalyana Mitras that you might have had in India. Has that felt like a big feature of your life, or have you felt you've kept in touch with them through dreams?
I certainly feel I've kept in touch with them, mainly or partly at least, not just through my memories, but through the sadhanas that I've done, and which I still do sometimes, because I always associate certain sadhanas with the teachers, in the case of the Tibetan teachers who gave them to me. So there's very definitely that connection. And of course I'm still in contact with Chechul Sangye Dorje, who is still alive happily. And he sends me little messages from time to time through someone who happens to have gone to see him.
In the Thousand Petal Lotus you refer to Sangharakshita 1 and Sangharakshita 2. Over the years, do you think one of them has been in charge, or have they taken it in turns, or do you think you have affected the marriage?
I think there was a time, in the early days of the movement, when the poetic Sangharakshita, for want of a better term, was definitely more prominent and more active. And I also happened to write quite a bit more poetry at that time, and of a kind that I hadn't written before. I think Sangharakshita, the philosopher, or let's say the translator, has always been more prominent. But I also look at it like this. The two Sangharakshitas are rather like that yin-yang emblem, where you get the two, so to speak, tadpoles. Do you know what I mean? A black one and a white one. But in the middle of the black one, there's a white dot. And in the middle of the white one, there's a black dot. Yeah? So it's a bit like that. There's a bit of Sangharakshita 1 in Sangharakshita 2, and a bit of Sangharakshita 2 in Sangharakshita 1. They interact. There's a sort of tension, a dialectical relationship between the two. And I think the movement is a product of that. Because the movement is many-sided. And yes, we emphasize study, we emphasize understanding the Dharma, but we also emphasize the spiritual importance of the arts. So I would say that in some ways the movement is the outcome of that creative interaction between these two sides of my character, which are not two different personalities, but two different ways in which the same person functions.
I mean, something that emerges clearly in your poetry is a tremendous capacity for passion and for intensity, which again, sometimes your outward, your mindful, reasonable outward appearance belies. I wonder whether that has been a theme in your life, the search for that level of passionate intensity of engagement with a project or with a person.
I can't say there was a conscious search, certainly not. But obviously some things have stimulated me, some persons have stimulated me more than others, and there was a correspondingly intense and more creative response.
I think of your friendship with Terry de la Mare, which you chronicle, in some detail in your latest volume of memoirs. I wonder to what extent you were surprised, whether you were taken by surprise by what seems to be the intensity of that friendship.
I wouldn't say intensity. Terry was a very good human being. He was, despite the depression, he was a very mature person. He was very balanced. He was very objective. And I felt I could discuss anything with him very freely, especially any deeper philosophical issue. I think it was that which was important to me, rather than any emotional intensity.
Because there are people who've read that volume of memoirs and have said, well, you were obviously in love with him.
Yes. Well, I have said, and people have agreed with me, that in all the close male friendships, and I'm not speaking of gay friendships, in all close male friendships, there is an element of falling in love at the beginning.
Yeah. I mean, you told me when we talked in 1988, an interview for Golden Drum, that your friendship with Terry was not a sexual
That's true.
friendship at all.
Right.
And yet, people around you assumed, and I think still assume, as some legends would have it, that it was a homosexual relationship. But one thing, you never explicitly denied it.
I didn't feel I needed to. I mean, one can't go around denying things that aren't true, even if you suspect that people are thinking them. So, and also, of course, you might think that, well, even if I was denied, well, they wouldn't believe me anyway, so what's the point? They've made up their minds that's the way it is, so what's the difference? I mean, I didn't experience that sort of suspicion painfully because, well, what would be wrong even if it was a homosexual relationship anyway? Yeah.
When you decided subsequently to have a sex life, and I remember when we talked in 1988, I said, well, goodness, considering that everyone had already branded you in this way, you went ahead and did it. Did you take into effect people's attitude to you? And you said, well, I think you said, well, I decided that I might as well be hanged as a sheep as a lamb, or something like that.
No, it wasn't really, not that I'd done it just for that reason. Yeah, it was more that it just happened the first time, and it seemed appropriate and right that it had happened. I certainly didn't sort of make up my mind in a cool, calculating way beforehand that this was how it was going to be. That the opportunity took me quite by surprise. But yes, I took advantage of it, and was quite glad that I had done so, and I'm still quite glad that I did so.
In our interview in 1988, you referred to your sexual activity as being, a process or a period of experimentation, which some people have found a sort of cold, calculating term. Some people find it disingenuous. I wonder whether you would say more about what you meant.
I can't remember exactly what I meant, except that I certainly didn't mean that I approached the whole question in a cold scientific spirit. I did once explain it to someone who had asked why I used this word, that I took experimental more in the sense that one uses it when one speaks of, say, experimental theatre. You just want to see how things will work out. But I must say, in the case of my first sexual experience and relationship, I didn't have those sort of thoughts. Someone, I suppose I can refer to Shabda without giving too much away. Someone did write in it some time ago, not so very long ago, that, I'm paraphrasing him, that it's a mistake to think of me as being cool and calculating. He thought of me himself as a very spontaneous person. And I think he got nearer to the truth than a lot of other people. And I think perhaps this is something that people may find it difficult to understand, especially now that I'm old, nearly 80, and I don't have the energy that I used to have by any means. I
mean, there is one of your sayings in, I think, Pieces of Fire. Is it something, I'm much better than people think and much worse than people think?
Yeah.
Does that feature here in this area?
I suppose in a way it does.
Yes.
Because some people like to divide one into almost the good Sangharakshita and the bad Sangharakshita, which can correspond to, well, the good Sangharakshita, let us say, is the Sangharakshita 1, and the bad Sangharakshita is Sangharakshita 2. So we want the good Sangharakshita. That's the one that really matters. We'll try to ignore or get rid of the bad Sangharakshita.
But do you think for you there was an impetus to break out of being trapped by people's expectations of the good Sangharakshita? Do you think that was part of it?
I don't think so. I was just, as it were, being myself.
Sure.
I was doing it for my own sake, and not to correct down other people's presuppositions about me.
Except as some people, as you know, would point out, you were, if only occasionally, still wearing robes.
Yes.
How did you deal with that? What did you think?
For me, it wasn't a problem. For me, it wasn't a problem. I knew quite well, what, to use that term, orthodox Buddhist would think. I knew that quite well. It wasn't that I was in ignorance of that. But I wanted to make the point that I was neither a monk nor a layman. So if I had discarded my robes, everyone would have thought I was a layman. And if I continued to wear them and continued to be celibate, everybody would have thought, I was a monk. I didn't want to be either. So I had to be some sort of hybrid for the time being, until the principle that I was concerned with was established, that the order was an order not of monks or of lay people. It was something quite different.
Sure. You were, older than most of us and a bigger person, as I've said, than most of us. And you were the head of the order, the founder of the movement. You must have taken into account or thought about the effect on the Sangha of the fact that it had a leader who was sexually active and in a series of relationships. Did that concern you? What effect that might be
not
having?
really, because I saw that other people were in sexual relationships and sometimes having a whole series of them. So that sort of thing, certainly in the circle in which we were all moving, was very, very general. It was nothing very surprising. And of course now perhaps people have settled down, they're more elderly, and they're looking back on their youth in some cases and back on me, and perhaps in some ways re-evaluating things in accordance perhaps with, in some cases, a more conventional standard. I think you can have, there are two models. In America they seem to be developing the model of the teacher as someone analogous, to a doctor or a therapist. So they've got to be very clearly defined. What's the word?
Boundaries.
Boundaries, yeah. But then the other model is the relationship between the student and the disciple, the teacher and the disciple, being, so to speak, completely open. Anything might go. This, of course, was Trungpa's attitude. I think I was a little bit, as it were, in between these two models, but perhaps with more of an inclination towards the second one I've mentioned, the more free and the more open. I certainly am not happy about Buddhist teachers, settling down into being something comparable to a doctor or a therapist, and having those sort of professional boundaries which are agreed upon and enforced and all that sort of thing. I think that's quite a betrayal of the Dharma if they're Buddhist teachers. I wouldn't say that anything goes. I wouldn't, go so far as Trungpa went in some cases. Where I certainly go a bit further, or did in those days, some of the more timid, sort of semi-professional teachers of the Dharma.
One outcome of your sexual orientation and your decision to engage in sexual activity has been that I think there are some women who consider that your view of women and your ability to relate to women is in some way affected, that you have a natural tendency to favour men, to idealise men in a way that you don't have with women.
I find that rather laughable. Due to my activities in the course of the last so many years dealing with people, I don't have the slightest tendency to idealise men, even those who have been quite close to me. I think I see them quite clearly. And of course I don't idealise women either. I see women as human beings and treat them as such, just as I see men as human beings and treat them as such. And I don't think that any woman who has ever come to see me individually can complain that I didn't listen to her or discuss things with her in an open and sympathetic manner.
But maybe that comes back to that issue of sometimes a seeming discrepancy between your public position and a more intimate private position, insofar as, there are statements that people find in seminars that you've given.
My public position is the Buddhist tradition. Let people read the Pali scriptures.
But when somebody stumbles, for example, on a sentence or a little conversation on a seminar where, it could be quite easy to think that women are being, made fun of in some way or blasphemed against, what advice do you have to a woman today who is to stumble on one of those sections of a seminar? How should she take it? How should she...
I think she should see my teaching and the Buddha's teaching and the FWBO and my relations with people, including women as a whole, and not attach so much importance to one passing remark.
In this area, where presumably that to some extent you run against the climate of the times, this is by no means the only area where you're very happy or prepared or willing to speak out, even knowing that what you say is going in some way to fall foul of current fashion, current thinking. It's something you've never been afraid to do.
Hope not.
And yet, I know when I've written back cover blurbs for your books and occasionally described you as a controversial figure, you've not been too happy about that.
Well, I'm not happy about any sort of label. I don't seek controversy as some people do. I just express what I think and what I've experienced, no more than that. And sometimes I do criticize, whether in a review or in a book review or in some other way, certain views which I think are inconsistent with the teaching of the Buddha, especially when those views purport to represent Buddhism. So I've never sought or courted controversy, but I've always been ready for it if it happened, to present itself to me.
But you've never seemed to feel the need to couch your criticisms in a language or maybe a slightly tentative mode, which is more of our current era.
Well, I'm not tentative where the Buddhist teaching is concerned. Yeah? If I had been very tentative about it, I wouldn't have devoted my life to it. And if necessary, I'm quite happy to stand alone. I don't want to compromise. And nowadays, people are so ready to compromise. They're so afraid of conflict, though of course it's never a real conflict. It's just a verbal sort of thing usually. But so often people want to smooth everything over, to make everything nice, everything sweet, everything acceptable. And I'm afraid there is this tendency at present within the movement itself, and I think it's a dangerous one, and which threatens our survival, or perhaps even, our survival as an effective Buddhist movement. We must have a cutting edge. Without that, really, we're nothing.
What would you see as being the essential features that would constitute a cutting edge at this moment?
I think no different from what they were in the past. I see no reason to change. Perhaps they need to be more strongly affirmed than in the past, just because the society around us has changed so much. There is, for instance, so much more concern about economic matters. So much concern about money and the wish for more money and a more comfortable life and so on. And this has started invading the movement too, I'm afraid.
But do you not think there was an element of inevitability to that as the movement grew to a particular size, even the order grew to a particular size, that there would be an inevitable broadening of our base, and therefore an inevitable intercourse with the cultures that we're in? We were no longer a small little intimate world unto ourselves.
But in each centre, each spiritual community is a small world unto itself, just as the whole FWBO was in the early days.
Though when you once put it to us that the FWBO was going to be more than merely a movement, it was going to be a people. I wonder whether by that you meant something along those lines, of our being a much broader community, a more heterodox community.
No, I didn't mean more heterodox, but I mean bearing in mind the fact that we do have a large presence in India. Our basis is broader in the sense that more people are involved with us who have a minimal degree of commitment to us. There is a sort of pyramid. At least in theory, there are order members at the top of the pyramid, and then a little lower down there are mitras who've asked for ordination, then there are mitras who've not asked for ordination, and then there are our friends, and that lowest level is broadening all the time. So the pyramid has a broader base, but it's only a broader base in a numerical sense, not in the spiritual sense.
But would you hope that at the top of a pyramid of commitment, that would be represented by people who are choosing to live quite intensively within a classic FWBO world?
Yes, I think so.
If that's the case, how do we avoid falling into the traditional model of a kind of monk-lay split?
It's not a monk-lay split, because some of the people at the top of the pyramid might be married, others might not be.
So you would allow for that?
Yes, inevitably. Yeah, but they're making only the point that, as we've said in the past, commitment is primary, lifestyle secondary. And genuinely secondary, yeah.
To what extent do you think of the movement as a child of your spiritual life, but also of your humanity, of your radical humanity?
I can't say that I think very much of the movement as my offspring. I don't think in that way at all.
But I do feel you have tried to inject into the movement something of a spark of the radicalism with which you've tried to live. Yes.
I've certainly tried to transmit, certainly to individuals, something of what you call my more radical approach, my more radical spirit. I do detect nowadays that little flame is flickering rather badly in the winds of change at the moment, and I'm rather sorry to see that, and I can hope it will be revived and strengthened.
What would it take?
Well, it would take more individuals being more committed to the revival of that flame and feeling it within themselves and wanting to communicate it to others. Not anything organizational.
No.
I might, of course, be tempted now to suggest that more senior and organizationally active order members might be well advised to take a year off of quiet, solitary reflection. I'm sure the movement wouldn't collapse in the meantime, I'm quite sure of that. And that might give them a better perspective on what needed to be done than tinkering with the organizational arrangements.
We hope you enjoyed this week's podcast. Please help us keep this free. Make a contribution at freebuddhistaudio.com/donate. And thank you.